The story you are about to hear contains frightening facts. When you listen until the end, you may be psychologically affected for a few days. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more.
Seba lived a solitary life, tending to her fields with an almost obsessive dedication. Her small farmhouse was situated on the outskirts of a quaint, sleepy town, surrounded by miles of fertile land. Every morning before dawn, she would rise and head to her fields, her feet sinking into the damp earth as she meticulously cared for her crops. Her days were a blur of planting, watering, and harvesting, and she seldom ventured into town. The townsfolk whispered about her, saying she was touched in the head, but Seba didn't mind. She found solace in her routine, a semblance of order in her troubled mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Seba would make her way back to her modest home, a weary but satisfied smile on her face.
There, on the edge of her vision, stood the remnants of an abandoned village, its crumbling structures silhouetted against the twilight sky. The village had been abandoned for decades, its origins shrouded in mystery and legend. The older townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, recounting tales of strange occurrences and unexplainable disappearances. They said the village was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had perished within its decaying walls. Seba had always been fascinated by these stories, drawn to the eerie aura that surrounded the deserted settlement. One particularly chilly evening, Seba found herself unable to sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her mind restless and agitated. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the old house to creak ominously. In the stillness of the night, she thought she heard faint whispers, barely audible over the wind's mournful wail. Unable to ignore the unsettling sensation, she got up and peered out of her window, her eyes straining to see the village in the darkness. To her surprise, she saw a faint light flickering among the ruins. It was a cold blue light, like the glow of a ghostly lantern. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched, transfixed by the eerie sight. The light moved slowly, weaving its way through the skeletal remains of the buildings, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance in the night. Seba felt an inexplicable urge to investigate, to uncover the source of the mysterious light. The next day, as she worked in her fields, Seba couldn't shake the image of the flickering light from her mind. Her movements were mechanical, her thoughts consumed by the village and the secrets it held. The townsfolk's warnings echoed in her ears, but curiosity gnawed at her, compelling her to venture into the abandoned village. As dusk approached, she gathered a few supplies and set off towards the derelict settlement, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. The path to the village was overgrown and treacherous, winding through dense thickets and uneven terrain. The air grew colder as she neared the outskirts, and an oppressive silence enveloped her. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the dry leaves, and even that seemed muted, swallowed by the weight of the surrounding darkness. As she crossed the threshold into the village, a chill ran down her spine, and she felt as though unseen eyes were watching her every move. The village was even more desolate up close, its buildings reduced to skeletal ruins by the passage of time. Weeds and vines had reclaimed the streets, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Seba walked cautiously, her lantern casting a small pool of light in the encroaching gloom. She made her way to the center of the village, where the light had appeared the previous night, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As she stood in the village square, Seba felt a sudden drop in temperature, and her breath came out in frosty puffs. She shivered, drawing her coat tighter around her. Her lantern flickered, casting wavering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. She turned slowly, scanning the ruins for any sign of life, but saw nothing. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. Suddenly, a soft, mournful melody broke the silence. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down Seba's spine. She followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The music led her to a dilapidated church, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The heavy wooden doors were ajar, and the melody seemed to be coming from within. Taking a deep breath, Seba pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The interior of the church was dark and musty, the air thick with dust and neglect. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and the stained glass windows were shattered, their colorful fragments lying in heaps. At the far end of the nave, where the altar once stood, she saw a figure hunched over an old, out-of-tune piano. The figure's fingers danced across the keys, producing the haunting melody that had drawn her in. Seba approached cautiously, her lantern held high. As she drew nearer, she saw that the figure was that of an old woman, her face obscured by a tangle of white hair. The woman's clothes were tattered and stained, and her fingers were skeletal, the skin stretched tight over bone. Despite her appearance, the woman played with surprising dexterity, the music flowing from the piano with a haunting beauty. "Who are you?" Seba asked, her voice trembling. The old woman paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Slowly she turned to face Seba, revealing a face etched with deep lines and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. She gestured towards a book lying on the altar, its pages yellowed with age. Seba picked up the book, its cover worn and cracked. As she opened it, she saw that it was a diary, filled with neat, elegant handwriting. The entries were dated from decades ago, detailing the lives of the villagers and the events that had led to their demise. As she read, a sense of dread settled over her. The diary spoke of strange occurrences, of a malevolent presence that had haunted the village and driven its inhabitants to madness. The final entries were particularly disturbing, describing how the villagers had turned on each other, driven by fear and paranoia. The old woman was the last survivor, left to document the village's descent into chaos. Her final words were a desperate plea for forgiveness, a lament for the souls lost to the darkness. Seba closed the book, her hands trembling. She looked up to find the old woman gone, the piano now silent. Seba felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave the village. She turned and fled the church, her lantern swinging wildly as she ran. The wind had picked up, howling through the empty streets and whipping her hair around her face. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and she heard whispers, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. She stumbled through the village, her heart racing, until she finally reached the path leading back to her farmhouse. As she crossed the threshold into her own land, the oppressive feeling lifted, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. She looked back towards the village, its ruins now shrouded in darkness, and felt a profound sense of relief. She vowed never to return, to leave the village and its secrets buried in the past. But the memory of the old woman and her haunting melody lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Over the following days, Seba tried to resume her normal routine, but she found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. The fields that had once brought her solace now seemed ominous, the shadows between the rows of crops filled with unseen threats. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and she often caught herself glancing towards the abandoned village, expecting to see the flickering light or hear the mournful melody. One night, as Seba lay in bed, she was jolted awake by a loud, insistent knocking at her door. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her lantern and crept downstairs. The knocking continued, growing louder and more urgent. She flung the door open, expecting to find a desperate traveler or a lost townsfolk, but there was no one there. The night was still and silent, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As she stood in the doorway, trying to calm her racing heart, she heard the melody again, faint and distant. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the village. Against her better judgment, Seba stepped outside, drawn once more by the haunting music. She followed the sound, her lantern casting long, wavering shadows as she made her way back towards the village. The village was even more foreboding in the moonlight, the ruins bathed in an otherworldly glow. The music led her back to the church, and as she entered, she saw the old woman at the piano once more. This time, the woman's playing was more frantic, her fingers flying across the keys in a desperate, chaotic rhythm. Seba approached, her heart pounding, and saw that the old woman's eyes were wide with fear. The old woman looked up at Seba, her mouth moving soundlessly. She pointed to the diary on the altar, and Seba understood that she needed to read more. She opened the diary and flipped to the final entries, where she discovered a passage she had missed before. It spoke of a ritual, a way to appease the malevolent presence that had cursed the village. The ritual required a sacrifice, a life given willingly to break the curse. As Seba read, the air around her grew colder, and she felt a malevolent presence closing in. The old woman's playing grew more frantic, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around her in a cacophony of voices. Seba realized with a growing sense of dread that the village's curse had not been lifted, and that the old woman had been trapped here, waiting for someone to complete the ritual. Seba looked at the old woman, her eyes pleading for release. She felt a surge of sympathy and fear, understanding that she was the one who had to break the curse. With trembling hands, she placed the diary back on the altar and turned to the old woman. "I will do it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The old woman's eyes filled with gratitude, and she nodded, her fingers finally stilling on the keys. Seba took a deep breath and walked to the center of the church, feeling the weight of the malevolent presence pressing down on her. She closed her eyes and began to recite the incantation from the diary, her voice steady and clear. As she spoke the final words, she felt a searing pain in her chest, and the world around her began to fade. The last thing she saw was the old woman's face, peaceful and free at last, before darkness claimed her. The next morning, the village was silent, its curse finally broken, and Seba's body lay in the church, a final sacrifice to end the haunting.
To hear more suspenseful and chilling stories like this one, please consider supporting my channel by subscribing and liking the video. Your support means a lot to me. Thank you!